Brent crude oil just hit $112.78 per barrel. That's a 55% surge in March alone, the biggest monthly jump since the contract began in 1988. Today, we're diving into a bold policy proposal that could shield Americans from these brutal price spikes. A monthly, one-week, nationwide $2 per gallon fuel stabilization policy during wartime and major oil crises. You'll learn how wartime price controls actually worked in the past, why current oil volatility is crushing everyday families, and whether this kind of emergency intervention could be the economic lifeline we need. Let me bring in someone who's been studying these exact scenarios. Help me understand. When we talk about fuel price controls, are we talking about something completely unprecedented?
Actually, no. The United States has a rich history of using price controls during crises, and they've been remarkably effective when implemented correctly. The Emergency Price Control Act of 1942 is probably the best example. It was signed into law by Franklin D. Roosevelt on January 30, 1942, and it established the Office of Price Administration.
Wait, 1942? So this was during World War II?
Exactly. But here's what's fascinating. The legislation was actually introduced in November 1941, before Pearl Harbor. This wasn't just a wartime reaction, it was forward-thinking policy. The act was designed to check speculative and excessive price rises and inflationary tendencies to support national defense and security.
That's incredible foresight. How well did it actually work?
The results were pretty remarkable. According to research from the LPE project, the consumption basket tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for low and moderate income families rose just 12% between May 1942 and January 1946. That's an annualized rate of around 3.3% during a massive war.
3.3% annually during World War II? That seems almost impossible.
Right? And get this, during those same 5 years of wartime mobilization, national output more than doubled, unemployment dipped below 2%, and real civilian consumption increased by 50%. The federal budget deficits ranged from 12.7 to 27.5% of GDP, but inflation stayed controlled.
So massive government spending, full employment, doubled output, but stable prices. That completely challenges what we think we know about inflation.
Exactly. But there's an important caveat. The original Emergency Price Control Act had problems. For 9 months after it passed in January 1942, the price index for working-class consumers continued rising at 0.44% monthly, which is about 5.3% annually.
What was going wrong?
Agricultural commodities were effectively exempted from price control. It wasn't until the Stabilization Act of October 1942 that they got comprehensive control. The lesson here is that you can't just control fuel prices in isolation, you need to control the entire supply chain.
That's a crucial insight. Now, let's fast forward to today. We're seeing these massive oil price spikes again. What's driving the current crisis?
According to recent reporting, the US-Iran conflict has effectively shut down shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and global oil supply has fallen by about 8 million barrels per day, roughly 8% of world demand. That route normally carries about 20% of the world's oil supply.
8% of global demand just gone?
Yeah, and the impact is brutal. U.S. West Texas Intermediate futures have gained about 53% in March and settled above $100 for the first time since July 2022. We're seeing gas station workers literally using black tape to adjust prices as they rise.
Black tape to adjust prices, that's such a vivid image of how fast this is moving. What does this mean for regular people?
Well, according to FuelLogic's analysis, gas prices impact the economy by affecting inflation, transportation costs, and consumer spending. The U.S. pumped 21.91 million barrels per day in 2023, representing 22% of global trade. So we're deeply connected to these global shocks.
And gasoline isn't just about driving to work, right?
Exactly. Gasoline is essential for transportation, agriculture, industries, and businesses that rely heavily on fuel. When gas prices spike, it drives up the cost of everything else. It's this cascading effect through the entire economy.
So we're basically seeing economic warfare against consumers. How are other countries responding to this crisis?
Asian economies are deploying some really aggressive strategies. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry has extended fuel subsidies for wholesalers to keep retail prices below 170, 180 yen per liter. South Korea implemented the maximum legal fuel tax cut of 37% to curb domestic inflation.
37% tax cut? That's massive government intervention.
Right. And China is utilizing strategic petroleum reserve releases to manage domestic supply-demand imbalances. These aren't free market solutions. These are coordinated government responses to protect their citizens from price shocks.
It sounds like every major economy except the US is actively intervening. What would a $2 per gallon cap actually look like in practice?
Based on the historical precedents, you'd need comprehensive authority. The Defense Production Act of 1950 actually gives the president tools to expand productive capacity, allocate scarce resources, and prohibit price gouging. Those authorities are still there.
Wait, we already have legal authority for this kind of intervention?
According to the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator's research, the DPA's origins actually trace back to emergency economic stabilization authorities deployed during World War II. President Truman used it for price controls in 1951, and Nixon used it for price ceilings in the early 1970s.
So the legal framework exists, but how would you actually implement a monthly, 1 week, $2 cap?
You'd probably trigger it when oil hits certain thresholds, like $100 plus per barrel, and implement it for 1 week per month to provide relief while maintaining market incentives. The government would need to cover the difference between market price and the $2 cap.
1 week per month is interesting. It's not permanent price control, it's emergency relief.
Exactly. And you'd need to look at the current price breakdown. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, as of June 2025, crude oil represents 52% of the retail price, refining is 16%, distribution and marketing is 16%, and taxes are 16%.
So if crude oil is 52% of the price, and we're seeing these massive crude spikes, that's where the government intervention would need to focus.
Right. And there's precedent for this kind of targeted intervention. Canada designed a national gasoline rationing plan in 1979 using printed stamps to limit private motorists' fuel use while giving priority access to ambulances, freight carriers, and farmers.
Printed stamps for gas rationing? That's like something out of a history book, but it actually happened in 1979.
And it worked. During the oil shocks of the 1970s, Canadian governments kept domestic oil prices under control and helped cover the cost of more expensive imports. They understood that when essential goods become scarce, you can't rely on price alone to manage the crisis.
That's a key point. When left to market forces, access to basic goods becomes dependent on who can pay the most.
Exactly. Research published in Sustainability, Science, Practice, and Policy shows that lower-income households are hit hardest by these price spikes. A $2 cap would provide direct relief to the people who need it most.
But wouldn't this be incredibly expensive for the government?
It would be costly, but consider the alternative. The page content shows that global fossil fuel subsidies hit a record $7 trillion in 2022. We're already subsidizing energy. This would just redirect those subsidies to consumers instead of producers.
$7 trillion globally? So we're already spending massive amounts on energy subsidies.
Right. According to research by Bezdek and Wendling, the U.S. federal government provided $644 billion in energy subsidies and incentives over 50 years. The infrastructure for government energy intervention already exists. We'd just be using it differently.
So instead of subsidizing oil companies, we'd be subsidizing consumers directly during crisis periods.
Exactly. And there's growing recognition that this kind of intervention is necessary. The Philippines has declared a national emergency in response to energy supply risks. Mauritius has imposed consumption restrictions. These aren't radical ideas anymore.
It sounds like we're in a moment where emergency energy policies are becoming mainstream again.
The International Energy Agency has identified 10 measures that can be implemented quickly by governments to ease oil price pressures on consumers. Emergency intervention is becoming standard policy response.
What about the argument that price controls create shortages?
That's why the monthly 1 week structure is smart. You're not permanently distorting markets, you're providing temporary relief during acute crises. The World War II experience shows that comprehensive, well-designed controls can work without creating shortages.
And the key word there is comprehensive. You can't just control one piece of the supply chain.
Right. The Emergency Price Control Act initially failed because agricultural commodities were exempted. Any modern fuel price stabilization policy would need to address the entire supply chain: crude oil, refining, distribution, and retail.
So we're talking about a coordinated, temporary intervention during genuine emergencies, not permanent market distortion.
Exactly. And the current situation, with Brent crude hitting record monthly gains and oil supply disrupted by conflict, is exactly the kind of emergency this policy is designed for.
When you step back from all this, What we're really talking about is treating fuel price spikes like the economic emergencies they are.
That's exactly right. When global oil supply drops by 8% overnight due to geopolitical conflict, that's not a normal market fluctuation. That's an economic shock that requires emergency response.
And we have both the historical precedent and the legal authority to respond. The question is whether we have the political will.
The precedent is clear, from World War II price controls to Canada's 1979 rationing plan to current Asian government interventions. Emergency fuel price stabilization isn't radical policy, it's proven crisis management.
Here's what this really comes down to. We can either let oil price spikes devastate working families, or we can use the tools we already have to provide relief during genuine emergencies.
And the monthly one-week structure strikes the right balance. It provides meaningful relief without permanently distorting markets. It's emergency medicine for the economy.
Emergency medicine for the economy. I love that phrase. It captures exactly what we're talking about here.
The next time oil prices spike due to war or supply disruption, Americans shouldn't have to choose between filling their gas tank and buying groceries. We have the tools to prevent that choice.
That brings us back to where we started. Brent crude hitting $112.78 per barrel, the biggest monthly surge on record. These aren't normal market conditions, and they don't require normal market responses. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time you see gas prices spiking due to war or crisis, remember, we don't have to just accept economic warfare against consumers. We have the precedent, the authority, and the policy tools to fight back.